Helicobacter pylori infections, and I invite Dr. Piyush Ranjan from Delhi to start with his talk.
Are my slides visible?
Yes, sir.
Good evening, everybody. So first of all, let me begin by thanking Dr. Vishal Sharma for inviting me for this talk. So I'll be talking basically on treatment of refractory H. pylori infection. A lot of has been, what I'll discuss has already been covered. Various regimes have already been discussed by Dr. Usha Datta. So there will be an overlap in that presentation. Basically, I'll discuss under these three headings: definition and mechanisms of refractory H. pylori, the principles of retreatment, and what are the different regimes and recommendations, a simplified version of it. So the definition of refractory H. pylori is that H. pylori infection which persists by non-serological tests even after 4 weeks. It may be after one or more completed courses of a currently guideline recommended first-line H. pylori eradication therapy. And as has been mentioned by both the previous speakers, the patient should at this time be off PPIs as well as an antibiotics. It differs from recurrent infection where non-serological test would come negative after eradication, and then the patient tests positive subsequently. So refractory infection is different, recurrent infection is different. There are different mechanisms which cause refractory infection. They can be classified as microbial factors, host-related factors, and system-related factors. The three most common mechanisms which engender refractory H. pylori are antibiotic resistance, gastric pH, probably the cytochrome metabolism plays a part, and patient compliance is a very, very important part. Dr. Usha Datta has already mentioned in her talk about the ways to increase patient compliance, which is very important for a successful H. pylori eradication. Now, as I mentioned, antibiotic sensitivity is the single most important predictor of H. pylori eradication. If you have an in vitro resistance to clarithromycin, the odds of treatment failure rises to around 7-fold. And if you have an in vitro resistance to levofloxacin, the odds of treatment failure rise to around 8-fold. The prevalence of antibiotic resistance, this is a huge data from around 45 countries, more than 50,000 patients. Clarithromycin, the primary resistance is between 10 to 34%. And what is more important, that if there is a previous history of clarithromycin exposure, the secondary resistance goes to 15 to 67%. Levofloxacin, the resistance doesn't rise much. Metronidazole, again, the resistance rises. So it is very important for retreatment patients to take a very good history of prior antibiotic exposure. Resistance to amoxicillin, tetracycline, and rifabutin is very uncommon. Dr. Usha presented data on Indian data on prevalence of H. pylori resistance. This is a paper published in 2003, multi-center studies. Probably there is a lot of variation in this data, which probably reflects the local antibiotic susceptibility. In this initial data, the quinolone used was ciprofloxacin, very low resistance. Clarithromycin resistance was around 44%. And subsequent studies have shown clarithromycin. This is a recent study from Kashmir, and this is a recent study from Karnataka. And as I said, regional variations might be important. This study from Northeast shows a very low resistance to clarithromycin. So it is very, very important to have our local sensitivity pattern. India is a vast country, and we might be having different antibiotic susceptibilities. Metronidazole resistance all across the country, it has been very high. Amoxicillin resistance, there has been conflicting data. Tetracycline resistance is quite low. So testing for antibiotic resistance, conventional, there are two ways: conventional culture-based methods. These are labor-intensive procedures. This is a fastidious organism to grow. The success rates are at the best 80 to 95% in research studies, which are not replicated in day-to-day practice. Non-invasive testing, among the non-invasive testing, stool culture-based testing is very important, mostly because it does not require a repeat endoscopy. Molecular resistance testing is very important. Upcoming tool. It can be done in stool, it can be done in fresh biopsy specimens, and most importantly, it can be done in the stored biopsies, the paraffin embedded biopsy specimens also. So the molecular testing is very important as far as the treatment of refractory H. pylori is concerned. The different mechanisms of antibiotic resistance have already been alluded. I will not go into these details. The most important issue for retreatment is that in spite of in vitro resistance, metronidazole is useful in clinical practice because there is very little, in spite of in vitro resistance, it might still be useful. And very importantly, as Dr. Usha also mentioned, that to date, there is no resistance to bismuth, which has been reported. Bismuth is a non-absorbable compound. It acts locally, and it is very useful both in the primary treatment as well as the subsequent treatments. Now, as far as the host genetic factors are concerned, gastric acidity plays a very important role. H. pylori, as was mentioned earlier, is most susceptible to antibiotics between pH of 6 to 8, because at this pH, the replication of H. pylori is maximum and the antibiotics have their best action. And apart from this, the half-lives of clarithromycin and amoxicillin, two very importantly used antibiotics, are dependent on the pH. At gastric pH less than 2, the half-life of clarithromycin is around 15 hours, amoxicillin it is around 1 hour, and at gastric pH more than 7, it is more than 68 hours. And this forms the basis of dual amoxicillin and PPI high dose therapies, where PPIs are used at a very high dose or given at a 4 times per day, which increases the efficacy of amoxicillin. So this basically raises the questions that are rapid metabolizer phenotypes of CYP2C19 associated with a higher rate of eradication, high rate of eradication failure? The answer is no. The current data is insufficient to support genetic polymorphism testing for guiding therapeutic selection in refractory eradication therapy, or for that matter in the primary therapy. Now, adherence to therapy is very, very important. In primary setting, at least, there are studies to show that if the patient completes more than 60 to 90% of the prescribed treatment, the chances of eradication are very high. And the most common barrier to compliance is possibly the complexity of a regime and high pill burden. And patient communication with the patient plays a very important role. And very interesting, 2 recent trials from China, which shows that use of interactive smartphone-based medical app or text-based reminders during treatment improves the adherence to primary therapy. Now, with this, we come to the principles of the retreatment, the 3 factors which I mentioned. So we have to take care of that. Use antibiotics to which H. pylori is least likely to be resistant, obtain a sufficiently high gastric pH, and ensure compliance. So now let's look at the principles, what we would follow in the retreatment. Always take a very good history, and previous antibiotic use is taken as a surrogate marker of resistance. We do not use clarithromycin and levofloxacin if they have been used in the previous therapy. Amoxicillin and tetracycline can be reused. Resistance remains rare even after their prior use. There is an issue in the American AGA guideline regarding the penicillin allergy testing. Nitroimidazole nitroimidazoles, that is metronidazole, can be reused even if there is resistance in vitro, and this resistance might be overcome by using higher doses, 1.5 to 2 grams per day, and addition of bismuth. But then this increases the pill burden further and increases the side effect further, which might further decrease the compliance. The longer treatment duration provides higher eradication rate. Dr. Usha showed this data that even for primary treatment, the longer duration of treatment has got a better chance of eradication. So sensitivity testing should be done after 2 failed attempts at treatment. However, selecting eradication therapy based on prior antibiotic exposure is not inferior to selecting therapy based on in vitro antibiotic susceptibility. Dr. Usha Datta also showed a study regarding that, and this is a recent study published in Gastroenterology. 205 patients each treated by resistance-guided or empirical therapy, 78% eradication in the resistance-guided therapy and 72% in the empirical choice of treatment, and this was not significant. So properly designed empirical therapy based on medication history is an acceptable alternative to genotypic resistance guide therapy for eradication of H. pylori infection. Now, the various regimens which are used, basically bismuth quadruple, levofloxacin triple, concomitant, rifabutin, and high dose dual therapy. I'll discuss briefly about these two in the end of the different regimes which we see. These regimes have been already discussed by Dr. Usha Datta in detail. So what do we choose? There are different guidelines, and let's see how does it go. So if a patient has received a prior clarithromycin-based therapy, all the guidelines agree that you would use either a bismuth quadruple therapy or a levofloxacin triple therapy. Again, there is a recommendation that since levofloxacin has got a high degree of resistance, if we have population data available, if the resistance of levofloxacin in general population is less than 15%, we can go ahead and use levofloxacin-based therapy. If bismuth quadruple therapy has failed as a first line, then the Maastricht and Toronto consensus recommends using a levofloxacin triple therapy, or in cases of high levofloxacin therapy resistance, we can use bismuth with other antibiotics or using a rifabutin triple therapy. The ACG guideline recommends a clarithromycin triple therapy. However, this is not an acceptable choice. So we'll come to the other things in the subsequent slides. So just to reiterate this, if patient has failed a prior clarithromycin triple therapy, the option is either using a levofloxacin triple therapy or a bismuth quadruple therapy. Both of them have a similar cure rates. However, the side effects are lower with levofloxacin containing triple therapy. The pill burden is lower, so the compliance is going to be higher. And there are studies which show that if you use a low dose levofloxacin, the efficacy remains the same. So this further decreases the side effects and probably compliance. If a patient has received prior bismuth quadruple therapy, then the option is either to use a fluoroquine containing triple or quadruple therapy, or in areas of high quinolone resistance, we can use a combination of bismuth with other antibiotics. However, with availability of rifabutin and more evidence being available with rifabutin, probably rifabutin-based therapy is the first choice if the patient has failed prior bismuth quadruple therapy. Now, what happens if patient has failed 2 prior therapies? Now, let's look at individual examples. If the patient has received first-line clarithromycin-based therapy and second-line bismuth-containing quadruple regime. So what do we do in such a patient? Here, the option is using a fluoroquinolone-containing therapy or rifabutin-containing rescue therapy. If the patient has received first-line clarithromycin and second-line fluoroquinolone-based therapy, here bismuth-based quadruple therapy can be used. However, if the patient has received the first-line bismuth quadruple and subsequent levofloxacin triple therapy, then a rifabutin triple therapy or a high-dose dual therapy can be used. So what is this high-dose dual therapy? Basically, here we use the amoxicillin in a high dose, because if we use it, and not only in high dose, but the frequency of administration is at least thrice a day, this avoids the trough levels and increases the efficacy of amoxicillin. And the pooled eradication of such a regime is nearly 70% when used as a salvage therapy. This has also been used as a primary therapy where the efficacy is higher. Now, a word about rifabutin. Rifabutin is basically a rifamycin derivative. In a meta-analysis using this PAR as a salvage treatment, the pooled eradication rates are nearly 79% when used as a second-line therapy, and it drops down to nearly 66% when it is used as a third-line therapy. The use of rifabutin should be balanced against the high cost. There is a risk of myelotoxicity. However, the dose at which it is used in H. pylori eradication, that is 300 milligrams per day, would not have myelotoxicity. And one of the important concerns is that if we use it more freely, then resistance among MTB strains might be promoted. Now, what do we do if patient has got multiple failed therapies? So in this situation, we should look at the potential benefit of the H. pylori eradication. So the most important point here is to look at the indication for which the treatment is being given. If the patient is at high risk of developing gastric cancer or peptic ulcer therapy, it is worthwhile. However, treating a patient with non-ulcer dyspepsia or incidentally detected with multiple regimes is futile. Similarly, it is also good to look at the patient condition in elderly with multiple comorbidities, multiple concomitant medications. It might not be worthwhile treating these patients with multiple therapies. Now, acid secretion is the another aspect of H. pylori therapy, and as has been highlighted earlier, that higher gastric pH translates into greater H. pylori eradication. It holds true for both primary therapy and for the salvage therapy, and becomes much more important for salvage therapy. This can be achieved by higher dosing or higher frequency of the first generation PPIs, using a later generation and more potent PPIs like esomeprazole or rabeprazole, or as it has been mentioned, the non-PPI gastric acid suppressants, that is vonoprazan. And vonoprazan, as has been mentioned, is more potent, and most importantly, its metabolism is not dependent on cytochrome and the cytochrome system. So it might be useful in situations where we are suspecting those metabolisms. There is not much literature of use of vonoprazan. Unfortunately, even after 5 years, 6 years of its use is limited mainly in Japan. And this triple therapy with amoxicillin and clarithromycin, it has got a high eradication rate. And in this study only, this was the original study of vonoprazan, published around 5 years ago in patients who had clarithromycin resistance. Still, the eradication rate was quite good. However, subsequent meta-analysis showed that eradication rates of vonoprazan-containing treatment, if we used intention to treat analysis, was similar to that of other PPI-containing regimes. So what happens, another good option, as we have seen that rifabutin and vonoprazan are two new potent drugs. So combining vonoprazan and rifabutin with amoxicillin, this is a very small study, but I have just mentioned it here to just let you know that these combinations are possible and can be useful. This is a small study, 3 previous failed therapies, 19 patients, and eradication was possible in all these 3 patients. All these 19 patients by using a 10-day triple therapy of vonoprazan, rifabutin, and amoxicillin. Adjunct therapies, probiotics have already been mentioned. Probiotics improve the success of H. pylori eradication by directly lowering the bacterial load, or more importantly, by probably decreasing the adverse events and improving the compliance. In a meta-analysis with subgroup analysis, it has been shown that only certain strains are more useful and not all. So this is an open-ended area, probably helps by increasing compliance and decreasing the side effects. Interesting new study concept of use of statins. This is a study in which 14 weeks of statins were given apart from the very different antibiotic and PPI combination, and this increased the eradication rate. Atorvastatin has been used for prevention of gastric cancer. There's a lot of literature available on that. Statins reduce the level of cellular cholesterol, and this leads to attenuation and translocation and attenuation of translocation and phosphorylation of CAG-A gene, which is the main pathogenic gene for H. pylori infection. A very interesting new observation, a new drug delivery system. This is a rodent study, which a new drug delivery system probably helps by increasing the compliance and decreasing the dose. Not yet in the human studies, but probably in future we might see such treatment. So what is the future of H. pylori therapy? So preventing refractory H. pylori infection, the most important thing is by improving the success of primary eradication therapy, as Dr. Usha Datta mentioned. Probably non-invasive H. pylori antibiotic sensitivity testing in stool might help in this. In future, we might see personalized H. pylori therapy by individual host genetic, non-genetic, and different microbial factors, and improving the epidemiologic information. In most of my presentation, I have skipped this, but it is very important to have local registries, probably, which are similar to Pan-European Registry on H. pylori, which gives you comprehensive data on the antibiotic susceptibility in that region. So to summarize, we should For refractory H. pylori treatment, we should identify the reasons of the previous treatment failure, review antibiotic history comprehensively, look at the locally available sensitivity if it is available, establish the indication of treatment. It is very important to know why are we treating this patient and ensure compliance. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Piyush Ranjan, for an excellent presentation. I think many of the questions have been answered already. I request Dr. Kuchar to take up the questions now. I invite sir to the platform.
So we can have a few questions. One, Dr. Usha, there was a question that do you alter the treatment in pregnant ladies?
Yes.
Dr. Usha, are you there?
Sorry.
Yes.
And
You need to unmute yourself.
I'm just unmuting.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, I'm here. So can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Do you need to alter the treatment in pregnancy?
Yes, it's a very important question. I didn't touch upon it, but in pregnancy, there is a controversy. There is no guidelines. However, in pregnancy, PPI has been found to be safe. Clarithromycin increases first trimester miscarriages, and metronidazole, usually the gynecologists are very wary of using it because of teratogenic effect. However, recent data shows that it doesn't increase teratogenicity, and amoxicillin is safe. So combination of PPI and amoxicillin may be the best regime. Now the issue is whether we should treat it during pregnancy or wait for the delivery to be over. Interestingly, it has been shown that H. pylori is associated with hyperemesis gravidarum, intrauterine growth retardation, preeclampsia, and various other pregnancy-induced complications. So people feel that if you can eradicate, you should with whatever regime is best available, and preferably start in the second trimester unless the patient has an emergent need for eradication.
Right. Dr. Amit Datta may be leaving soon, so we could ask him first. In this, Dr. Saju Xavier has asked this question: in the setting of upper GI bleeding, can we use a positive serology only as a marker of positivity, since biopsy may be falsely negative?
So I think so. The problem with serology, as I mentioned, was that one problem is that it doesn't distinguish a current from a past infection because it's usually based on IgG antibodies. That's one problem with that. Second is the performance. Also, if you look at the sensitivity and specificity, they are not, in fact, they're lower than probably the rapid urease test or the biopsy. And finally, even if you look at the Maastricht consensus, what they say that because in serology, we are detecting an antibody. So the antibody which you're detecting, I think there may be variability in terms of to what antigen you're detecting because the strains may vary from population to population. So what the Maastricht consensus says, you should have a validated serological test in a particular population before you recommend it for use. I think those things are not really easily doable in this thing. So sometimes people just empirically treat also H. pylori considering it's such a common infection. Otherwise, we go by the reports. But serology is not an option as of now, a practical option in our country. So.
What is
ma'am, you want to add something to it?
I just wanted to add, sometimes I found some Russian kits and some other countries' kits being used in India, and those are not validated for our own strains. So we have to be careful before we start using any kit.
No, true. That's the main thing. That's what even the Maastricht do. So that the validation is important before we use, and that's something which we don't have for our population right now.
Yeah, just of the main questions, what is the seropositivity in India? Different parts, any data? What exactly current status?
So currently, there are hardly any. I think the studies of serology are mostly about 20 or 15 years back. Now there are hardly, and that time it used to be about 70%. Depending on the age of patient you are studying, the higher the age, the higher used to be the serology. It used to even up to 70 to 75%. But last 10 years, I couldn't come across much of serological because they are hardly used nowadays.
Yeah, but just to give an idea of the prevalence in this community, there's a question by Dr. S.K. Sharma to Dr. Amit Datta: why PCR for H. pylori is not catching up?
So two things. One is, as I said, we already have simple tests like RUT or a breath test. They're much cheaper than a PCR. As a molecular test, is quite expensive. So definitely not a first-line test. the benefit of PCR may be like in setting where you want to pick up an antibiotic resistance. So you can do a genetic test for antibiotic resistance. It may be helpful in that setting. But there also what we have to know that the PCR we are detecting the bacterial genes and the DNA actually. So the probe has to be identified. Now the 16S rRNA gene, which is what we use for microbiome for the bacterial detection, they are not very specific for H. pylori. Other species of H. helicobacter may also have a similar thing. Some people say we use a urease, the urease sort of related gene for that one. So which target gene to amplify for detection also there's a bit of a variability. And second thing is the techniques and the inhibitors, all those things which goes along is actually makes it a bit of a complex procedure. It's expensive. So mainly limited to setting where you are doing a antibiotic resistance thing, same like a culture thing. But for routine, no, we have simpler, cheaper tests. So why should we do that for the routine thing? Actually?
Right. Thank you very much. Yeah, since I thought that there are going to be more questions, but the panel discussion is also like
one
So
I think
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing here that in PGI, we are now started routinely doing stool antigen testing, and we are finding it very useful, a non-invasive method, ELISA based, and we are finding it very useful for detecting patients of H. pylori in dyspepsia.
We are using it for now for eradication. It's very good for eradication first. That's something what we are using. It's very good for eradication part also. Yes.
Sir, I have one query actually.
Yes, Dr. Adnan.
Yes, sir, for Dr. Piyush.
Yes.
Sir, actually, we have been using, I have been using rifabutin previously. It was actually quite toxic. And as you already said, that incidence of myelosuppression is very high. So now coming to vonoprazan. Previously also rivaprazan was launched by Zydus people. And I think at that time also we saw that the incidence of myelosuppression, including leukopenia, granulocytosis, was quite high. So, do you think this regime, which includes both vonoprazan and rifabutin, moreover in Asian subcontinent, it has been shown in few studies that rifabutin does cause this, it interferes with cytochrome P450 metabolism. So, I mean to say, what are your thoughts regarding this? Is this a rational combination, vonoprazan with rifabutin, particularly?
So that is just one study, just 19 patients who have 3 failed previous attempts for eradication. Rifabutin causes myelotoxicity if you use it at a dose of more than 600 milligrams. For H. pylori eradication, it is recommended at 300 milligrams per day. And there are studies to show that if you use it at 300 milligrams once a day, the eradication is better than 150 milligrams twice a day. Both the doses are used, both the dose regimens are used. 300 milligrams once a day is better than 150 milligram twice a day. And as far as vonoprazan is concerned, I mean, primary therapy, there have been studies which show that it might be better, but the same effect can be achieved by using the second generation PPIs, increasing the dose of PPIs or increasing the frequency of PPIs. So the whole idea is to increase the gastric pH to a level of 6 to 8. And in Asians, anyway, the fast metabolizers are not that prevalent as compared to the Caucasians. So probably we won't need to this. These are used in specific situations where you have previous failed therapies.
Right. I think we will have some more questions in the panel discussion. We have already overshot the time, and we can have rest of the questions, those which are not covered in the panel discussion, at the end of the panel. With that, I thank all the speakers and my co-chairperson, Dr. Varsha Gupta,
Thank you, sir.
for a very interactive session. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Vishal. Thank you, sir.
Can I just make one comment with the permission of the chair?
Yes, ma'am.
With the permission of the chair, I just want to make one comment. We should understand that eradication tested by any of these things is not true eradication, because basic researchers say that even when we say it is RUT negative or stool antigen negative after treatment, if you take a biopsy, DNA is still positive. So on PCR, so we may be actually just suppressing H. pylori and not eradicating. So I'm just bringing in a caveat to an expert group to keep in mind.
I think with that comment, we can close this session. I thank the chairpersons, Professor Kocher and Dr. Varsha for conducting this session. Let's thank the speakers for excellent deliberations. Now we